I know it's a bit weird to have the white chick from the UK show up to talk about Africa's migration policies, but I do believe that some of the learning that can come from Europe in the last 50 years is really important to how Africa as a continent decides to move its policy forward on this in the next 50 years. And that's not only from what Europe has done well, but from what Europe has done badly, and predominantly from how Europe has treated the rest of the world badly in taking its policy decisions in the last 50 years. So to start with, we have to take a consideration as to what we mean when we talk about migration. And I think actually here the European Union has created something very interesting for us to use as a benchmark, as a beginning point for policy development. And that's what's called the four freedoms. The four freedoms were laid down in the Rome Treaty, which I think is 1957, and these are the freedom of movement of people, goods, services, and capital. Now, in the modern era, I'd probably update that to include ideas as well, because the movement of ideas in a free fashion across a continent is as important, I believe, as the movement of people. For all of these things to function, however, there is something that underpins the potential outcome here, and that is trust in the state. In 1957, when these ideas were being developed by the EU, they were being developed in a continent that had very poor trust in its state institutions. It was coming out of a truly disastrous world war that had ended just over 10 years earlier, where the states had used the personal identifying features of individuals to create genocide on a scale that is almost unfathomable to anybody, even today. And the trust in state structures that is required to make public policy work on this is paramount. Because if you're going to give your ID over to the government and you're going to expect that the government deals with it well, you're going to want to trust that the government is not going to sell it to other people, is not going to abuse it in elections, as we've just seen the presentation on, is not going to sell it to the highest bidder, as we've had mention on corporate interests within policy development, although I know with interest that Facebook's on your flyer, so that was quite amusing for me. The second thing that's required is a development nowadays, is a development in GovTech. So a citizen's access to government technology functioning well. And this is something that we in Europe have done both badly and incredibly well, and the pairing of the two things has gone terribly. So we have some states within the continent who have done excellent things on GovTech, like Estonia, where the state will automatically register. If you are an elderly person and your spouse has just died, the state, because your spouse is in the state hospital system, the state recognizes that. It automatically adjusts your elderly pension benefit from the state to give you the single person allowance without you, in your time of grief, having to register this system yourself, because obviously your partner died in a state institution. And therefore the state has adequately recognized that the state needs to reform the way that it works with you in this new era that you're finding yourself in. Now, coupled with that, the real reason that I was asked to speak to you today, which is Linda asking me to speak to you about the UK's policy, coupled with that, the complete lack of development in the UK's migration technology development. We've seen the UK in the last 10 years become a space for tech like almost nowhere else in the UK. The entrepreneur's bonus has meant that coming to the UK to develop a company can be profitable for you as an individual. And this, although probably badly spaced in terms of the amounts of money that we're talking about, is a decent way of using the taxation system to encourage entrepreneurism and encourage small business. And within that, there was a visa that was created for a tech entrepreneur if they wanted to come and build their business in the United Kingdom. Nowhere in developing that visa did anybody say, but what if a tech lawyer in Kenya just wants to come to a tech conference in the UK so that she can go back to Kenya and develop tech within Kenya itself? This leap was absolutely never made in the concept, in the construction of visa and migration policies within the United Kingdom, and this is just a crime. in my opinion, particularly for a nation that wishes to present itself in the post-Brexit era as a globalized nation, as a global Britain newly on the world stage, and more offensively than ever, perhaps, as a nation that wishes to view Africa as a partner, but continues to refuse to treat Africans themselves as partners. So when we decide what migration policy requires on a continent where the European Union, as in general, as a union, and the states of the European continent wish to work so heavily with Africa, the areas of protection, not protectionism, but protection within public policy that I think are important, are GovTech, are access to law, not just access to lawyers, but access to law. Your ability to read laws of your nation is something that hardly anybody worldwide has done particularly well, although the Hansard Society is something that I would recommend looking up. This is the stenographic reporting of the UK Houses of Parliament, which is revolutionary in my opinion. Visas and movement of people to just attend business functions is of critical importance. And when we bring this back to tech, some of those big corporate firms who work so heavily across the continent are going to be the firms that everyone wants to sell technology into. Everyone talks about, African solutions for African problems, although I do believe that the tech that's developed in Africa will solve global problems, not African problems. If you, as a tech developer, cannot sell your product into a global company because the global innovation lab for that company is in Frankfurt and not in Harare, then the idea that Europe has that it's going to be this function capability of developing tech in Africa will never actually be realized. It will never be supported to be realized if that continues to be the case. The final thing I was going to mention actually is something that occurred to me before I wrote this particular presentation, which is on the Open Skies Agreement, because it is incredibly difficult to move around the continent, and any migration policies that change costs of visas or access to visas has to also look at the Open Skies Agreement possibilities that have been raised by the African Union in the last 3 years, because your ability to get on a plane in Nairobi and end up in Monrovia is so limited that it is going to impede the ability for tech, and legal tech in particular, to move across the continent and begin to develop these ideas, which will see the development of tech in Africa begin to revolutionize the economies of this continent. And I'd like to give just one example of this particular problem. I have a friend who runs a tech startup in Zimbabwe. It's a fast-moving consumer goods software product that supports produce tagging within the supply chain. So it's a supply chain management product. He is a Zimbabwean and Irish citizen, and he wishes to move his business to Kenya. Now, he in no way has the kind of capital required to just open a business in Kenya, to be able to move here and open it. This is not something he wants to do. He's Zimbabwean. He wishes to stay in Zimbabwe. And for all of the accelerators and all of the hubs in Kenya, the biggest amount of help that he found was actually from the Irish embassy in Kenya, rather than from anywhere else. And that's because what he really needed was someone to call up Henkel and call up Diageo to formulate a business-to-business relationship. And I think one of the interesting things that's come out of particularly in the last 3 weeks with the coronavirus issue, but more commonly with the issues around climate change, the number of companies in what's called the Global North who are making the decision no longer to go physically to another nation to go and have meetings or to attend conferences. This is a luxury. This is an incredible privilege for companies and for countries that have already formulated business-to-business and person-to-person connections that can now allow for telephone conferencing, for video conferencing. This is a development in how the world reacts to each other, to itself and across borders, that will not benefit the people who must make those initial connections before they are able to get to the point where they have a telephone conference connection. And this is something where I really hope that isn't what comes out of what's going on at the moment with the health situation in the world. I really hope that this doesn't put a block on the development of migration policies, and this doesn't put a block on the ability for business people to get from point A to point B, because that's where we really need to begin to develop work. And at the moment, the European Union is too afraid of people getting in boats in Libya to fully address the migration issues they have with this continent, while at the same time producing policy papers again and again about how the African Union and the EU should work together in the future. And I really hope that some of the policy we produce today can begin to address some of those issues and make Europe sit up and take notice. Thank you.